Welcome to Sorry Is This Boring? I'm Marika.
I'm Natalie.
Today we're going to talk about the film Ginger Snaps. The film Ginger Snaps was released in the year 2000, directed by John Fawcett. No relation to Farrah Fawcett.
Maybe. We're not
Maybe.
sure.
Actually, I did not look that up, so he could be related.
It's a conspiracy.
So, Ginger Snaps, a quick summary, is about two sisters, Ginger and Bridget Fitzgerald, who are very macabre young teens who are very, very close and they hate the world. And they're also both late bloomers. They haven't got their periods even though they're 15 and 16. So when Ginger finally gets her period, she's pretty traumatized. She doesn't want to be like everybody else. She thinks this is a terrible thing. You know, the trauma of menstruation. And the same night she gets her period, she gets attacked by a werewolf. And the film is about her transformation and trying to stop it.
And yeah, it's sort of about her transformation and her sister trying to figure out some sort of cure for her as she sort of becomes unhinged. I feel like I want to start off by saying something that we talked about with the Love Witch that we didn't record. This was during a private conversation. Was that a lot of feminist films are sort of based off of the female creator's own experiences a lot of the time. And when we were talking about the Love Witch, Marika was saying that it was kind of like a lot more relatable for you than it was for me, because even though I'm a woman and I can relate to a lot of the things in the Love Witch of being treated certain ways just because I look like a woman. There's still a lot of things in the way of presenting femininity that I felt like I couldn't relate to, and I felt like you were kind of saying that you can. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like with Ginger Snaps, it's something that I feel like I relate to a lot more in the experience of being a woman. And yeah, I just wanted to say that because I thought it was interesting.
Yeah. I think something that I relate to about Bridget and Ginger is their like interest in the macabre. You know, as someone who loves horror films and spooky, weird art projects, I found it very relatable.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I definitely want to go into like what I relate to within like their characters, but I just wanted to like start off by saying like I found it interesting that like, there's such like a broad array of experiences that are like shown in feminist films, and that there are some that can like encompass the entire experience of being a woman, and there's some that are like more individualized.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk about, John Fawcett. He is the director of this film, and he's actually mostly known for being a TV director. He directed the show Orphan Black, and he had another film that he directed, which came out in 2005, a British-German horror film called The Dark. He talks about in the press kit I was reading, he really wanted to make a metamorphosis horror film, and he also really wanted to work with girls. So he was friends with Karen Walton, who is the writer of the film, and he approached her about the idea. And something that was really interesting I found is that she was initially like not interested in working in the horror genre because she didn't really enjoy it, and something she said was, I generally find them very disappointing as stories and pretty predictable and frustrating in terms of depictions of females. But the more she spoke with Fawcett, she realized that there was like a opportunity to make something that was a bit more sophisticated in terms of its depiction of women. And she says that she wanted to create real characters with real problems and characters that are human beings whose struggles are based on relationships. She says that I found the horror element in the nightmare of trying to figure out who you are and who it is that you love. So I think that it's like clear they set out to put a twist on the horror genre, and I think they succeeded in doing that.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like it's really interesting that she was saying that she wasn't really interested in like writing a horror film, because like she found them to be kind of like tacky, I guess. But I feel like it sort of the film came out at a really interesting time because I feel like the turn of the century was like sort of when horror as a genre was becoming like really mainstream. People would like pack into theaters to see
Yeah.
like whatever like the latest horror film is, and so I feel like it was probably written at a time when like ideas about horror were changing pretty rapidly.
The film they actually started writing in 1995, and like being like a an indie film, it took a long time to get properly financed. And they like almost got it financed in like 1998, but they didn't have enough money, and then eventually they got it. And something that is really interesting, I thought, when reading the press kit, was that they were talking about casting the film in 1999 was actually a big struggle because in LA they were casting Bridget and Ginger in LA, and that was going well, but then they also had a Toronto casting director which they needed for all the other roles, and they'd like so much trouble.
Canadian film?
This is a Canadian film.
Yeah. Canada.
Yes, he is Canadian. John Fawcett is Canadian, and it was filmed in Canada. But Bridget and Ginger were cast from Los Angeles, and then all the other characters were cast from Toronto, but a lot of casting directors rejected the film because they thought it was offensive, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, I feel like that's very interesting, especially because we just talked about the critical reception for Love Witch, but I want to know why they found it offensive.
They just found it offensive because it was, vulgar, and it was, like, sexual, and there was too much blood. And I was, like, quite surprised. I think maybe, like, they eventually did find a casting director, but it was a struggle for Toronto compared to LA. And so I think that maybe just, like, speaks a little bit to, like,
Canadian sensibility.
Canadian sensibility, yeah. And another thing that is really interesting is that before the film even began production, this was sort of, like, this whole time, like, the film was in pre-production was, like, the spring, like, April 1999, which is the same time that Columbine happened. And there was also another shooting in Taber, Alberta, which is in Canada. And those both happened, like, the same time that this film was, like, in pre-production. So I feel like that might have had an effect on it. And there was actually, I couldn't find the exact article, but they mentioned it in the press kit that the Toronto Star, like, put out an article sort of slandering the film and making, like, connections to the shootings that were happening. And there was sort of, like, an intense frenzy in the Canadian media. There was, like, radio shows, print articles, all kind of, like, putting down the film. And Telefilm Canada had to, like, really defend publicly its choice. And so I think it's, like, really cool that this film, like, still went through despite all that, and that actually the reception when it did come out was quite good. It did, like, generate a kind of, like, small cult following.
That's pretty sick. Was there any sort of, like, initial backlash for, like, having, like, a film that's set in high school with, like, gore, or, like, do you think that there was a spike of movies that happened after those tragedies, or do you think people were, like, more conscious of, like, trying not to make those kinds of films? Because I feel like it could go either way,
I feel like it was kind of probably a mix of sort of things. Like, like I know that this film, before it was released, it was sort of people said it was a teen slasher film, which is far from what it is.
Yeah.
So, um, something like that happening with a bunch of teenagers dying after the big,
Mm-hmm.
tragedy of a bunch of teenagers dying, I could see um, why it would be such an easy target in the media. But I also think that it is sort of like a catch-22 that these things are, getting more popular and they're also getting more criticized, you know? And I think, like now, for example, all the trending films are the ones about diseases and zombies taking over the world because there's this disease happening, and it's the sort of thing of you thinking it's like kind of insensitive for these films to be coming out now, but at the same time
It's so bizarre.
So it's on everyone's mind.
Yeah.
So
like, I feel like the last movie I want to watch right now is Contagion, but people
but everyone's
love that
Contagion.
shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think that,
and sorry to cut you off, but it's funny too, because I feel like there was also this big surge of serial killer biopics and stuff, that happened a few years ago, or probably up until there's a new thing that's keeping people's attention, but I feel like that's sort of another thing,
Yeah. But I think, because of the way this film was more of a cult film, it did the festival circuit, and that's how it got so popular. And there's definitely different kind of way people definitely different crowds and different critics that are talking about the film than if it was just, something that was released big blockbuster in all the cinemas.
Yeah. That's true.
Another really thing that I loved when I was reading about the making of this film is that the director, John Fawcett, has this team that he's literally been working with since he was 8 years old. And
that's amazing.
They've been making films together since they were 8 years old. Aww. And the DP of this film, the camera operator, the second unit director, the composer, they've all been making films together since they were in school. And I just thought that was so beautiful. And even the production designer had also been friends with Walton and Fawcett long before the script was even written. So I love hearing that, because that's something so special about these sort of low budget films being made by groups of friends. And I think that's
so
cool.
Special.
It makes
so
it so
beautiful.
Special. Yeah. I think it's why it's so good.
And I feel like you can tell when there's passion involved in a project, and it's not fueled by just, trying to make a bunch of money. It's something that you and everybody else who's on your set really wants to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was tough, most independent films are just there's not enough time, and everything goes behind schedule on films anyway. So it was definitely tough, reading about the shooting schedule. There's 16-hour days, and they'd be starting at midnight some days, and it was also Canada, and it was cold outside. And, but I read that the first day of pre-production, on location, was when they did all of the photos for the girls' death project. They did them all in one day, and apparently they were really worried about creating a scene with the neighbors and offending anyone, but everyone was quite lighthearted about it, and they were just trying to be really respectful. But there was just them spending the whole day taking these death scenes.
That's so fun.
So I feel that's the first thing I really want to talk about the film is their death project.
Yes. Yeah, I love that so much. Something it honestly reminds me of is the band Mayhem. So, for those of you who don't know, Mayhem is a Norwegian black metal band whose start was in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And they were involved in a lot of controversy, a lot of deaths and church burnings and things like that. And They're sort of just obsessed with the fantasy of what a metal band's image can be. They popularized corpse paint, which was definitely inspired by people like King Diamond, um, kind of Kiss, to be honest. Metal musicians that would paint their faces black and white, but they would take it a step further and paint their faces to look like actual corpses. And would take a lot of pictures covered in fake blood or real blood, and there's dozens of photographs that you can find online and in books because they were just as much like into the image and the fantasy of being dead and being brutal that they took so many photographs of themselves. And I feel like something that's really interesting about it is that I think a lot of times that kind of fantasy seems more normalized for boys or men, and I really enjoyed seeing girls sort of carrying out that death, gore, fantasy.
Mm-hmm. I was gonna say that actually reminds me of one of the questions I was gonna ask you. Is that Pie Wacket, the first film we looked at, and this film, Ginger Snaps, they both have female protagonists who are obsessed with death and, violence and gruesome things associated with metal music and just death in general. And my question was, I guess, why do you think we've been attracted to these films where these women are portrayed in loving these macabre things, and why, based on your own personal experience, maybe why is it so appealing, and also why is it so rare?
I think I feel like it's kind of rare just because, something we talked about with the Love Witch is that male is the social norm, If you think of anyone that's famous metal musicians, famous horror film directors, you would think of all men. The idea, especially with making art, it's not really that women aren't interested in those things. It's just that men get more of the opportunity to create those things.
And that's something that's addressed in the film. There's a scene when Ginger and Bridget are burying the body of Trina Sinclair, the popular girl that they've accidentally murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And Ginger says, don't worry, people never think chicks can do stuff like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she said a girl can only be a slut, bitch, tease, or the virgin girl next door. Mm-hmm. And, there's just sort of ideas of roles that women are supposed to play, and I think it's just more of a norm for men to be interested in violence.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I'm somebody who loves just art about death and violence, and I think it's a healthy thing to be able to experience those things without going out and being violent, know. A lot of it can stem from feeling like an outcast. I feel like I grew up in kind of a similar sort of neighborhood, suburban subdivision as these two main characters, and I was always told that I was weird ever since I was a little kid, and I just was made to feel like I didn't belong there. And I feel like when you feel like you're being pushed away by this immediate world that's around you, there's different ways you can cope with that. And that kind of interest in darkness is one of them, you
Mhm.
know? And
Yeah, and I think that the death project that the girls have kind of like sums up perfectly perhaps why, their feelings towards the town and the society they're living in, and their feel like their fascination with death as a response, and it shows them dying in these domestic situations that are absurd, and suicides that are very like gruesome and graphic, but they're all within the home, within the backyard. There's one where she's like impaled on the picket fence and crushed by the garage door, and I think that something that they fear is just dying in this town, really, and also just that there's another thing that Ginger says. She's like, you kill yourself to be different, and then your own body screws you. And it's like the idea that she is so, they're both so desperate to set themselves apart from everyone else because they hate everybody else. And one easy way to do that is to not be, all preppy and happy. It's to be dark and moody and interested in taboo, gruesome things.
And it's kind of like taking control of people pushing you out by, taking interest in and doing things
that people won't like.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny that that was something I totally didn't think about, was just their sort of like fear of, dying in that space that they just feel so uncomfortable in. It's like, this is probably not the greatest thing to say, but I'm gonna say it anyways. But like, I had this like really terrible joke when I was in high school where I said that if there was like ever something that happened and I was like fatally injured in my high school, I wanted my friend to drag me out of the high school so I wouldn't die on school property. And so I feel like I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah. And also I think that their mother, part of the reason they're so hostile towards her is just that she represents what they don't want to be. She's like fully assimilated, perfect mother in this little town. I guess like one thing I was thinking about, which is also related to the mother, is the idea that they do kind of they don't need her because they have each other. They act as each other's mothers, and they have this like inseparable bond, which is so strong and it's so exclusive, and so like everybody else is like excluded from it initially, including their mother. But they're presented as like kindred spirits, and they have this weird bedroom love cave which is completely separate from the rest of the house, and they live in there in side by side.
And I feel like it's the only space that they seem to fit in to.
Yes. And it's a really interesting, I really like the set because it kind of in one way looks like this dungeon with like unfinished walls and weird lighting, but there's also these teenage female elements like the beaded curtain,
and there's like the tapestry bedspreads that are like very witchy. Who is it?
It's T-Mobile. Oh. I didn't pay my bill. Fuck you, T-Mobile.
Fuck you, T-Mobile. This podcast is actually sponsored by T-Mobile.
So, waive my bill.
I guess like something I wanted to start with was the practical effects, because I mean I also did a little research myself. About sort of history of CGI in horror movies. I guess the first question that I kind of had coming out of watching this for the fourth time is I was just wondering when CGI in horror movies became popular or widely used because there's no computer generated effects in this film whatsoever. And and I was just wondering if that was sort of an aesthetic choice or if it just wasn't a widely used thing at the time. And I think it was honestly a little bit of both.
I actually read that Fawcett was really anti-CGI, and he was like very strong on the fact that he wanted to do all practical effects.
Yeah, I mean, I totally respect that because I love practical effects. I'm definitely a 70s, 80s horror movie, like monster movie nerd, and I love the look of it. There's something that's so tangible about it. And kind of like what I was saying with Pie Wacket was that the fantasy, like the monsters and the gore, doesn't really have to be sleek for me to believe it in the context of the film. You know, it's all about the suspension of disbelief. You go in to watch Harry Potter, and you know that it's gonna be about wizards flying on broomsticks, you know, and talking to snakes. And so you're not going to question that.
Yeah.
And so I feel like his sort of rejection of it kind of goes along with what I was reading about, where it sort of became more popular or widely used around the mid 1990s. There was definitely stuff that was made before then, like big blockbusters like The Mummy, and I think the most notable one is obviously the Terminator film with the liquid robot. One of the biggest ones to use a lot of them in a sort of horror movie is Event Horizon, which is like a sci-fi horror, and that came out in 1997, so it's sort of like mid to late 1990s when it became really big to use, and that was clearly, you know, probably during pre-production of Ginger Snaps, and it's kind of the same thing when any sort of form of technology comes to be, is that there's gonna be people who reject it.
Yeah.
Just with literally anything in film. You know, when digital film came around, when sound came around, there was people that were like, I'm not using that.
Yeah.
You know? And so I feel like it kind of coincides with the rise of CGI coming about right about the time when this film was being made.
Yeah. I think like also just the film's sort of cult feeling. It feels, you know, and the fact that feels like such like a labor of love, like a group of friends, and I feel like it's got the aesthetic of sort of campy cult films from like the 70s that all use practical effects, and so I feel like it was very good for him to not want CGI in this case.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of similar with what we talked about with The Love Witch. Was so many things were in that film were just made by hand by the creator, and yeah, it feels like, yeah, exactly what you're saying, more like a labor of love.
I was reading again on the press kit online, which also is just a beautiful gem of a website from the 2000s. It's still up and running.
Sounds wonderful.
So if you love looking at archaic websites, then check out the Ginger
Early
Snaps
internet.
But the Ginger, the actress, was saying how she would just be all day covered in blood and glue on her face, and she couldn't sit down or touch anything because she was covered in blood.
Oh.
And it was awful, but it was worth it because it looked so good. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I honestly feel like some of the best depictions of werewolves I've seen have all been practical effects, and they've all been just so impressive to me.
Yeah.
You know, even though a lot of people prefer CGI. Like two that I can think of, I would say, is Fright Night and An American Werewolf in London.
Yeah.
And just the labor that goes into just the transformation, seeing things grow
Yeah.
on the body is just, I can't even begin to understand how that's done,
Yeah.
and it's amazing. I guess another thing that I love about the film is the costumes. I feel like talking about that, there's definitely a lot of meaning behind the choices of what the main characters wear. But I love that, like, most of the time they're in really baggy, formless clothes.
And also, I love Ginger's transformation through costume.
Yeah.
Of when, at the beginning she is dressed in black, baggy clothes. And then once she starts, transforming, she's gotten her period, she's been scratched by the wolf, she's transforming, she starts dressing in a different way to, like, garner attention from men. And I love both versions of her costumes.
Yeah, and I think it's something that definitely is a trope, like the transformation of the female through her appearance. It's seen a lot in romantic comedies. I feel like it was definitely... I want to say it was definitely popularized in the 80s with, like, John Hughes films and stuff, but I feel like that's not totally true, because I could even think of, like, Vertigo, I'm sure there's plenty of stuff before then, but I think it was definitely a fresh take on that, and I feel like especially with the 90s, there's a lot of times it's sort of the transformation into popularity through appearance.
Yeah.
The transformation into hotness.
Yeah.
But I think that there's definitely a different meaning behind her transformation.
Yeah.
Even though those can definitely be factors, I think there's a grander meaning.
Yeah. And I think that something I liked is that she remains an outsider through her dress. Even though it transforms from sort of not hot to hot, it's like she's still different, and people, she's, the other way, people think she's like the girls think she's too slutty, and they think she still dresses quite goth, and people think she's still just too weird, but in another new way where she's sort of a threat, I guess.
Yeah. I also think the whole family dynamic is hilarious.
Yeah.
Just the mom is just so sweet, and the father is just the most stereotypical dad you can think of.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want there to be talk of periods at the dinner table because we're eating.
I think, like, one of my favorite scenes in the movie is when Bridget is in the van with her mom, and the mom has found the fingers and found the body buried in their little cubby house. Yes. And she's like, tomorrow I'll light a match and I'll fill the house up with gas, and then we'll just start fresh, like just us girls. And she's just, like, on board. And she's, like, gotten the fingers in this little Tupperware box. She's just, like, bringing around with her. And she's just so prepared to bully. And I think it's something that's kind of a bit surprising, because I feel like you don't expect her to react this way just based on, like, how they view her and everything about her persona. She wears, like, pink bows in her hair and wears 80s sweaters and bakes cakes and she loves buying flowers and
yeah, but I think it's something that sort of furthers this feminist idea in the film. The idea that she talks about how the father just won't understand, which I think is something that in any context a woman deals with is just men in their life just being, like, completely unable to understand certain aspects of the female experience.
It's funny because there's like an earlier scene when the husband and the wife are talking, and he's like, "They're up to something. I know it." And she says, "No, they're just being teenage girls." And he says, "But then why? No, they're up to something because why are they suddenly listening to you? That's suspicious." And it's sort of really rude, but also, you know, it could be that it's not like an attack on her. It's just it's kind of truth. You know?
I feel like it's funny because
right.
in the context of the film, he is right.
He is right.
But...
And she says, "You just don't understand." And you think he's right, and she's just being fooled by them. But then, like, as the film goes on, and she just is fully on board, she, like, finds the body, she's not shocked. She's just there to help them. And so it makes you think that maybe she isn't as clueless as she's been made out to be, you know? And no one could really understand, like, their mother could. You know, no one would be there for them in that way.
Totally.
I also read something that I found interesting, but there was a lot of scenes, like, when they were shooting in the greenhouse, when it was meant to be daylight, but it was actually nighttime. And so they were just blasting lights through the glass of the greenhouse with diffusion. So there's, like, scenes in the greenhouse where it seems daylight, but it was night outside. But
that's crazy.
The magic of cinema. And it's all because they sort of got off schedule, because, you know, films always do.
Yeah. Another little thing is that when Trina dies in their kitchen, and she hits her head on the counter and falls into the cereal on the ground, and her blood is mixing with the milk. I just love that.
Yeah, that's a good scene. I love that because they have this death project, where it's sort of like, you know, romanticizing, like, the beauty of these death scenes. It's kind of like a metaphor for the horror itself, because I feel like there is, you know, if you're interested in that, it is so kind of beautiful to see the gruesome death. You know, and especially since everything was handmade, it's all made, you know, so much love and labor went into everything. You know, even the dead dogs, somebody made that.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful, and it's disgusting at the same time.
Yeah.
So, I guess one big topic in the film is a sister's relationship to puberty and femininity.
And I feel like this is the sort of part where I feel like I relate to them a lot. When Ginger first gets her period, when she's in the park, and she refers to it as the curse, which is, like, funny in relation to the film because it's about werewolves, but it's also funny in the way that she is viewing this sort of natural thing that happens to people with uteruses.
Yeah.
And she was saying, like, your whole body screws you. And I feel like that's something that I felt heavily growing up. I cried the first time I got my period because I was just so pissed that I got it. It was just something I never wanted to deal with. Like, I didn't want to, like, have to, like, grow up and become a woman and, like, have all of those things that entails happen to me.
Yeah, and something also I found very interesting she said was, you know, if you find me hanging out by the tampon dispenser talking about boys, just shoot me. And, like, she really thinks that this is going to change her. But also something else I was thinking about is the idea of menstruation horror films. There is a couple. One thing I would think of is Carrie.
Yeah.
So I think there is a very interesting connection between menstruation and horror. That there's probably, like, a lot of places that you could go with analyzing that.
Oh, yeah.
I guess the most obvious one to me would be that it's, like, the fear of castration, which you could trace back to a Freudian theory.
Yeah, I think when periods are discussed through a male perspective, it's about castration. It's like about Freud, which is something I definitely don't agree with, but it's interesting in relating any sort of bodily phenomenon in relation to the vagina
Mm-hmm.
is something that arouses fear in men.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing of women bleeding. I think this was something that I read about in it was Horror and
And the
the
Monstrous.
Monstrous Feminine. Who is that?
Barbara Creed.
Barbara Creed. Yeah, was that she was kind of talking about concepts of Freud in relation to uh, female monsters and things like that in horror films. The biggest sort of problem with, uh, I think, men's development, uh, like infantile development in the society that we do have, is um, teaching the gender binaries. And so Freud's whole theory is that the boy is taught that he has a penis and the girl is taught that she has what it would be considered the lack of a penis. It's
Mm-hmm.
just a hole.
Yeah.
And so that's something that sort of, when seen by a young boy, arouses fear inside of him because he thinks that there's been something horrible that's happened in
Mm-hmm.
order for this person to have lost their penis.
Yeah.
And the idea of menstruation continues on with that fear.
Yeah.
It's like the gaping wound.
Mm-hmm. And just also a fear of female, you know, genitalia. And what it does is something that is quite prominent in a lot of films.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess a small thing is that I really like that there is a lot of period blood shown in this film, kind of like when there's the bloody tampon shown in The Love Witch.
Yeah.
So much. It's something that is real that, half of the Earth's population experiences,
Yeah.
but it's something that's so rarely shown,
Mm-hmm.
even though it happens to half the population once
Yeah.
a month.
Something that I found interesting about the film is that a lot of people thought that this idea of um, becoming a werewolf as a metaphor for puberty and getting your period was kind of obvious, was a critique, but I think it's funny because it is obvious, which is why it's so successful, because they're exploring this in so much more detail, I guess, or something.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like there's definitely times when a film being super obvious has its faults, but I think especially when you're trying to say something, um, that that's important. It's not really good to shroud everything in metaphor. Uh, I think you need to be able to have a wide range of your audience to be able to understand what you're trying to convey without having to just explain it to them outside of the experience of viewing it.
Yeah, and I think something that's really interesting about this film is it's done. It's so much a body horror film, in that it is exploring like the horror of something from inside of you becoming horrific, and I feel like that's something that people can experience, like as a woman going through puberty, when you're literally bleeding, and blood is traumatic to see, and then the added thing of there is literally a virus inside of her, changing her into a beast.
Yeah.
By combining her getting her period with the becoming the monster is like so perfect, because she's changing into this monster that is so scary to society because she's unapologetically sexual, and also eating people, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's like the ultimate fear.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. I kind of feel like almost the werewolf has two different meanings for Bridget and for Ginger.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like through Ginger, the monster and the wolf is totally that, you know. It's sort of her becoming a monster through like her budding sexuality, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and she's something that is like sort of the way that she acts on her urges is something that's so different from what you would normally expect from someone that's, you know, a young woman. You just usually always imagine them as just being taken advantage of by men,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and she's someone that wants sex and she goes out and she gets it, you know. And there's even this one part when she's hooking up with, what's his name, Jason?
Yeah.
Um, and he's like keeps telling her to relax, and he's just like, oh, just lay back and relax, who's the guy? And she's like, who's the guy, who's the guy? And she gets like so mad and riled up over that, which
Yeah.
I feel like is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like for Bridget it takes on a whole different meaning to me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it definitely does have to do with just the idea that she feels like she's losing her sister to puberty, you know?
Yeah, I think so much of it is just, like, as soon as she gets her period, there's this idea of, that it, like, it alienates Bridget, and this idea of abandonment. She's, like, losing her. And, you know, Bridget, Ginger, there's even a scene where they're getting tampons, and Ginger's like, you never say just and cramps together, you know, she's become, like, patronizing, and just, you know, she doesn't understand, and I feel like Ginger feels that way too a little bit. There's even a scene where she's saying that, you know, we still have the pact, like, we're still the same and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do definitely feel like a lot of it has to do with their dynamic, and, you know, Bridget feeling like, you know, with her sister going through puberty and her not, there becomes this huge disconnect of things that she knows, you know,
Mm-hmm.
sort of things that are happening to her body that Bridget doesn't, like, hasn't experienced, you know, things that she's doing, like, you know, hooking up, you know, exploring her sexuality is something that Bridget doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have any experience in.
And also
But
just the fact that they have this exclusive bond,
mm-hmm.
and, you know, there's a scene, the same scene where they're getting tampons, and there's this, you know, guy who's like, you know, Toke will take the edge off those cramps. And at first she's resistant, but then she does go into the van and smoke with him. And she's leaving their sort of isolation pact when she does this. This is the first time in the film where she actually abandons Bridget and hangs out with somebody outside of just the two of them.
I kind of feel like Bridget's uh, relationship with the monster can kind of be interpreted as her being queer. Because I remember, you know, being a teenager and feeling like I was, you know, before I really understood about my sexuality, I felt like I was losing my friends to puberty,
Mm-hmm.
you know, even though I still, you know, got my period and was like, my body was changing and stuff like that. I felt like, you know, women, like my friends that were women would talk about, you know, hooking up with boys and, you know, different things that they did to like groom their bodies in ways that I just didn't understand at all.
Yeah.
And it was kind of really upsetting in a way because I just felt like, you know, they were becoming this thing that I felt like I couldn't be,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt like they were losing interest in me because of that.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that relates a lot to Bridget's experience,
Mm-hmm.
where there's never any time where she talks about liking a boy, even though there's this whole thing with her and the drug dealer. I think it's clear, she makes it so clear the whole time that it is platonic. All they're trying to do is find a cure, and I don't think it was, I would be surprised if it was the director's intention to have there be any sort of sexual tension between the two of them.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. I mean, you know, she's so desperate to find this cure for her sister. But, you know, even if she did manage to reverse the lycanthropy, she wouldn't be able to reverse her becoming an adult woman, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that something that's interesting about that idea is that there's, like, so much of the film where, you know, Ginger's like, these are just normal things. Like, it's not me becoming a wolf. And we're just like, no, this is, like, wolf things. And she's like, no, it's just normal puberty, you know? And they're like, I'm just getting hair in new places and stuff. And there's even, like, there's, like, a scene after she hooks up with Jason. And she, like, comes home covered in blood because she's eaten the neighbor's dog.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, like, a part where she's, like, lying on her bed talking about it. About him, like, lying under her, squealing and stuff. And I feel like there's, like, a moment you're not sure if she's talking about, like, murdering this dog or having sex for the first time.
Yeah.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's, like, definitely something to what you're saying about just the unrelatability of everything Ginger's going through and just, like, the need to save her, you know?
Yeah.
It's so real, but also because she can relate.
Yeah.
I know, I think that, like, there's definitely the possibility that there's, like, that she's queer, but I feel like there's also, it's, like, hard to say for sure, because I feel like there's definitely the aspect of that she's just meant to be this, like, pre-sexual being, you know? And also, like, you know, the idea that they're opposites in that Ginger becomes, like, the impulsive sexual one, and Bridget is, you know, she's the reason and the logic and the morality, and they sort of divide more into those extreme personas.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any, like, true evidence to prove that Bridget is a queer character. I just felt that it still makes sense looking at it through that lens.
Yeah, there is a lot of homoeroticism in the film.
Yeah.
And I feel like it could be just something that we have both picked up on because we're perverts, or it's something that's actually there.
I feel like it's fairly clear.
Yeah. I feel like there is obviously the most obvious moment when she's talking that, you know, Ginger's, like, all about fully transformed, and she's saying to Bridget, she's like, it feels so good, it's like touching yourself, and then she says, like, we should swap juices, you can be like me, and she says, you know, we're not even really related anymore.
And she, like, whispers that into her ear as she's, like, backing her up against a wall. I feel like that's, I don't know. I feel like it would be hard not to interpret that as any sort of sexual tension.
But I felt like there was a lot more scenes of sort of sensuality or sexual tension in their relationship. Like, there's the scene where she creeps over to her bed and she, like, looks at her tail, like, poking out of her underwear,
and I feel like the part when she pierces her, and she's, like, grabbing the bed frame and, like, wailing and moaning.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, a metaphor for penetration.
Okay.
But yeah, there's definitely, and I can't really speak to why that's in there.
Yeah, I feel like I can't either.
So I was reading an article an essay called Love, Death, and Transformation in Ginger Snaps, which is basically looking at it through, like, the lens of Freudian analysis, which has got a lot of flaws, you know. And so she was basically talking about, like, Freud has a lot of ideas about, you know, familial relations and sexual desire, which could be a whole essay in itself.
About him wanting to diddle his mother.
Yeah. And one thing that in this essay they were talking about was the idea that of this like Oedipus thing happening between them, because even though they're sisters, they basically are each other's parents, because they've like replaced each other as the parent in their relationship, you know? And so there's like this element of Oedipus in there, and just like displacement of sexual desire, I guess. But I don't really think that was any intention of the director, you know? And I don't know if I fully agree with a lot of those ideas that Freud has.
Yeah. I feel like there's got to be some sort of intent with that. I mean, I don't exactly know what it is. I mean, I feel like I could also, I guess, see it as some sort of like a little bit flowers in the attic-y kind of way, where because they're so isolated together, like when they do develop sexual feelings, it kind of gets like muddled with them really only being each other's relationship.
Yeah, and I think also just like the fact that they are so committed to like their isolated bond, you know, like they have this death pact of like being together forever. Like that's what they want. Like it's throughout the whole film, even though they drift apart. That's what both of them wants. Even at the end, when Ginger is a wolf, she like wants Bridget to be a wolf with her because she doesn't want to be without her. And once they develop sexual desires, like they have to do that together too, you know, because otherwise it would mean separating somehow, I think.
Yeah.
So I think it's because this film really is a love story between these two sisters above anything else, I think.
I feel like another thing, just as kind of a wild guess, is if we were going in the route of Bridget being a queer character, I feel like it could be also just a metaphor of her having to confront her own sexuality.
Yeah.
And especially because Ginger, as she becomes more and more the wolf, she kind of has this like thing, this way of being that I think ties into her power, is sort of being sarcastic, jokey, teasy in a way.
Yeah.
Even, you know, right before she says the sort of incesty kind of things to her, in the school hallway, and she's holding up the janitor who she just slashed his throat and is like, "Come here, Bridget, let me touch your boobies," and stuff like that. So I feel like her kind of saying those things to Bridget in a way is almost like her knowing about Bridget's sexuality in a way.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And sort of forcing her to confront it.
I think that's true. I think she's like, you know, Ginger becomes like more animalistic in these like sexual impulses. But there's also like the element of like possessiveness over Bridget that starts to develop. Like I think she's sort of like, Bridget becomes like, you know, like she's like a mother animal and Bridget's like hers, you know, and she makes like jokes like earlier on about the janitor like staring down her shirt, you know? And I think there's like an element of her like wanting, like she's sort of joking that, you know, she's getting this attention from men and that Bridget isn't. But she's also like this, the conflict of them not being the same because of that, you know? So I think it's like a weird mix of like trying to get Bridget to confront her sexuality in the hopes that it will like awaken what Ginger's having. And she like, I think more than anything, she like wants them to be the same, you know?
Yeah. And I think, you know, going along with their relationship, I feel like there's so much of this journey that Bridget goes on, because honestly, I feel like it is Bridget's film.
Yeah.
And
yeah, because even at the beginning, like before she's even been bitten, before she gets her period, she says, she's talking about their death pact, and Bridget's like, we made that pact when we were 8, you know? And Ginger's like, no, we made this pact, like it's not stupid, even though Ginger's like, come on, like it's not real, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Ginger has always kind of been the alpha, and she's always been kind of like asserting that they're this special couple, and
Uh-huh.
it's really special, and it's just them. And
Yeah, and her mother, even when she has a conversation with Bridget, is saying that she's always just done whatever Ginger has told her to do, even when she was little.
mm-hmm.
And I feel like so much of Bridget's journey is not only like being able to free herself from just kind of like feeling like Ginger's puppy dog, but also realizing that Ginger needs her as much as she needs Ginger.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of like. I mean, obviously they have a lot of toxic things in their relationship, but I think that is beautiful in a way, you know?
One more thing, this doesn't relate at all to what we're talking about, I was thinking about, is I really like the scene where she's shaving her legs, like, because of all the wolf hair, and then she, like, sees, like, this big, like, horn or nail or claw sticking out of her foot. And then her mom comes in the bathroom, and she's like, shuts the curtain. She's like, Mom, get out of here. And she's like, what? I mean, it's nothing I haven't seen before. And she's like, yeah, but I'm fat. Just get out of here. And her mom's like, oh, honey, like the models in these magazines all take speed to look like this. And I just think it's funny. And also there's like a similar thing when she's putting the meat in the freezer and they have a body in there. And so Bridget's like, Mom, what do men want? To distract her. And I love how they always use, these trials of womanhood as distractions and like womanhood and adolescence, these distractions for their mother from all of the things that are happening that are more gruesome, you know? But I just think it's funny that they like create these situations where they have to pretend basically to be going through these things.
Yeah.
To hide what they're really going through.
Yeah, and I think that's what's kind of interesting about it, is as much as, you can read all of these things as metaphor for, feminine experience, for puberty, I think that at its core, it's a fantasy film. It's fantasy horror. It's a monster movie, and I think there's so much to that. And I think that the element of comedy is that every time they try to sort of figure out what's going on with Ginger, it's always written off as puberty.
Yeah.
And I think that's really genius.
Yeah, and I think it's like something sort of goes back to what Karen Watson, the writer, was saying. That for her the real horror is relationships and like navigating them, figuring out who you love, and that's so much what this film is, because they do find a cure for the wolf, the lycanthropy. They find the cure, but the thing that sort of makes it fall apart is just these like complex relationships, like it's like the relationship between Ginger and Bridget that sort of like makes it so hard to just get it resolved, even though they could.
Yeah. Definitely.
And that's because of their like actual relationship, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That ultimately ends in Ginger dying.
Yeah. Something I was reading about actually in relation to Freud was there's something that I just felt like could relate was after I read, gonna be honest, after I skimmed Beyond the Pleasure Principle, because it is hard as shit to read. But he has this discussion about this game that his little nephew played and relates it to PTSD from war. And basically his nephew will like take a toy and throw it behind his bed, so it'll disappear, and then he'll crawl under the bed and go grab it, and then keep repeating the action. So it's sort of, a lot of it has to do with the idea of children mimicking adults, because they want the power and control that they have, and, and it's an idea of reenacting this thing that happens when you finally understand what's going on so you can control it. Because, you know, when kids are in their infancy, and you hide something, they think it just disappears from existence, you know, but once they figure out that when they can't see it, it's still there, it's kind of an exciting thing. So there's this quote from him, from Freud, saying, "If man must himself die, he would prefer that his life be forfeit to an inexorable law of nature than to mere accident, which perhaps could have been in some way avoided." So it's kind of that humans prefer to have control in terms of their death. I think it kind of goes without saying that everyone would, you know, prefer not to die in some way that could have been easily avoided, like some stupid accident, you know? And so this sort of relates to the idea of war and PTSD in the way that if you're in some sort of situation where there's a near-death experience, you know, something that you had no complete control over, and that can be super traumatizing. And so it's sort of the idea of experiencing regression, and sort of reenacting things in order to gain control over the experience. You know, like repetition, compulsion, stuff. And so something I just found really interesting about that was the idea of sort of placing a lot of importance on one's death and their sort of desire to control it, which I think is honestly kind of a theme within Ginger Snaps. You find out right at the beginning that they have a death pact, and they talk about how they want to go out. You know, I mean, mostly Ginger, but still, you know. And I think something that I thought about a lot was there is a lot of trauma that the two experience after the werewolf attack. Which, you know, they spend all of the time before that sort of being super nihilistic, you know, talking about wanting to die and making jokes about other people and how they would die. And then when this actual near-death experience happens to Ginger that's totally out of her control, it's so scary for both of them. You know, Bridget holds her and is like, "I don't want you to die." And, you know, she's saying that she's in pain and she was so scared, you know, and shaking and stuff. And I think it's really interesting because even though that they're so attracted to the darkness, you know, everybody still has the same desire of not wanting some freak accident to be the death of them.
And I was thinking about that with the scene at the end. You know, Bridget says when Ginger's like a wolf and she's coming for her, and she says, "I'm not dying in this room with you, Ginger." And then Ginger jumps on top of her, and she, you know, Bridget's holding the knife and she dies, and I sort of like think of it as like Ginger sort of, you know, committing suicide in a way at her sister's hands, and it's like she's like, you know, her last way to have control over what's happened to her.
I think it's sort of wish fulfillment, and it's also Bridget being able to free herself from just being under Ginger, you know, like being the beta in a way. The beta wolf.
Beta cuck.
So I was looking up the history of werewolves, And there's been specific cases throughout history of people who were suspected werewolves and werewolf hysteria, and a lot of them kind of end up boiling down to just people being serial killers. And people committing like cannibalism and stuff. But there was one case that I actually found very interesting. It was this man who I would assume Peter Stubb. And he was a 15th century farmer in Bedburg, Germany. And so there's this folklore that he turned into a wolf-like creature and devoured many citizens of Bedburg. And he was blamed for the killings after being cornered by hunters who claimed they saw him shapeshift from wolf to human form. And he experienced like a super fucked up execution after confessing under torture, which, you know, reminds me a lot of witch trials, you know, confessing under torture to killing animals, men, women, and children. And eating their remains, which, honestly, through torture, you can get anyone to confess anything. He also declared that he owned an enchanted belt that gave him power to transform into a wolf, which was actually... There's a lot of sort of different types of folklore about werewolves, and some of them are, you know, you only turn into it on the full moon, but there's a lot of folklore about using a wolf pelt to transform. But obviously the belt was never found. And so his guilt is actually controversial to this day because some people believe that he wasn't a killer but a victim of a sort of political witch hunt. I mean, I guess werewolf hunt. But I find that very interesting, especially because during the last podcast, we talked about sort of the ideas of, you know, setting a feminist film in a specific time or during a specific phenomenon and what that would mean. And I was talking about the Satanic Panic. And, you know, that was a phenomenon that wasn't specifically targeted at women like the witch hunt was. You know, there was a lot of men that were persecuted, and as with werewolves throughout time, there was a lot of men that were persecuted for being suspected werewolves, which, you know, in hindsight is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting to take that phenomenon and look at it under a feminist lens. Like, if this happened to a woman, what would be the outcome, you know?
Yeah.
How would that transform the story? And I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
So what do you think was the intent of having the characters both be super late to puberty? Like, way later than the average teenage girl.
I guess I think it's just the idea to sort of tie that they can tie their otherness from the rest of, you know, their peers to this idea of not, you know, going through puberty.
Yeah.
And so I think, like, by doing that, they're able to connect the two in their mind and connect the idea then of going through puberty is going to make them like everybody else, you know?
Definitely.
Just the idea of you know, it being weird. There's something wrong with them, maybe. Who would win in a fight? Jennifer from Jennifer's Body or Ginger Fitzgerald?
I feel like Ginger. I mean, number one, she can beat the shit out of someone. You know, outside of being full werewolf. And I don't know, because I feel like Jennifer has demon powers. She's able to eat a person.
Yeah.
Just like Ginger can. But I think she still has a human form, and I feel like having a canine form, you're made to be a hunter.
Yeah.
You know, you can run really fast. You have the sort of, you know, muscle makeup to be able to really attack and kill a human, and so I feel like she would probably be able to win.
Yeah.
What do you think was the best cinematography in the film?
I guess my favorite piece of cinematography is, again, like the scene where Ginger's walking into the Halloween party, and sort of like low tracking shots of her, and it's all smoky. It's very cool.
True.
Okay, my next question is, what is your favorite scene?
Well, I mean, most obvious would just be the sort of montage of them doing the death photo shoot. I think is amazing.
Yeah.
And we do shit like that.
Yeah.
And it's cool to see it on screen.
Somebody else doing it.
Yeah. It makes me feel normal.
Yes.
Another scene that I really liked was, I feel like this again goes along with everything I've been saying about with both the Love Witch and Pie Wacket, but I love the sort of objective view of rituals. And so there's this one scene where they're juxtaposing Bridget and Sam cooking up the antidote, and it's juxtaposed with Bridget locked in the bathroom.
Yeah.
And there's scratches and blood all over the door, and she's just banging on the door, thrashing, screaming, and they're doing this sort of careful ritual. You know, it's delicate.
Yeah.
And I think it's really beautiful.
Yeah.
What do you think would change if this film was made today?
Something I think that would change probably is just that it might use like CGI. I mean, there isn't a lot of films that use such like practical effects nowadays.
Yeah.
They're much more rare, so I feel like I would hope that it would still be using all practical effects, but that's something that could change. And then I think, you know, the reception would change as well, I think. I think that, like, there is an element of, you know, what is taboo is always changing in film. And, you know, this film came out 20 years ago, and a lot has changed in, you know, cinema now. Even, like, I always joke that incest is the final frontier. but yeah, because it's still the thing that's, like, the most taboo to depict. But it's even on TV now. Game of Thrones, there's incest that happens, you know? And between two main characters, and so it's like impossible to say what would change about it, but I think it would be different. What is your least favorite werewolf depiction in cinema?
That's a good question. I feel like I really haven't seen that many werewolf movies. Let me just make sure. Okay.
Or TV.
Oh, I know. Twilight.
Twilight. Okay, that's what I was thinking too. I'm glad that you said.
Yeah, because I feel like most. I mean, werewolves aren't a genre that has ever gone through like a spike in popularity like vampires or zombies has.
Yeah.
And so there aren't really that many popular movies, or TV shows, really. I mean, there's Teen Wolf, which definitely rose because of Twilight, having a side character that's a werewolf, but it's not really the same, you know.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a huge spike in werewolf movies
Yeah.
and a huge interest in that. I think there's always just the sort of idea that, you know, people like seeing hot teenage boys also being monsters.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen any of Teen Wolf, so I can't say if that's my least favorite depiction, but I think definitely Twilight, because I think that the monsters in the film aren't really characters that are likable to me at all, and I kind of feel like in monster films, they're either monsters because they're misunderstood, or they're just monsters and are completely dehumanized, or they're likable villains. And I don't think that the monsters in Twilight, especially the werewolf, fits into any of those categories.
Yeah, they're just, like, they're likable. Like, they're, like, the good guys or something.
But they're not likable.
I don't know.
So that's the
It's
thing
weird.
to me.
And it's just, like...
They don't feel misunderstood.
Yeah. It's just meant to be sexy.
Yeah. But in a way that I totally don't understand.
Yeah. I think, like, of all the things with Twilight that are stupid, I feel like the whole werewolf subplot or whatever is just, like, one of the things I like the least about the Twilight world, because I just think that it's, like, it makes it so much stupider to me. I don't know.
Like, depicting both of the monsters?
Yes. And
I kind of
I don't know how I can explain it, but, like, if it was just vampires, it wouldn't be half as bad as, like, them also trying to depict werewolves in, like, competition with these vampires. And
I feel like I totally agree with that, in the way where I feel like it's cool if a TV show or a movie has a bunch of mythical creatures inside of it.
yeah.
But I think when you limit it to two and there being sort of a feud between them, it kind of gives me, like, Alien vs. Predator vibes, you know?
Yeah.
It's vampires versus werewolves.
Except that they're all sexy.
Yeah. Which doesn't really have anything that would interest me.
Yeah. It just feels like also such a, like, the least interesting way to create conflict in this world.
Yeah.
The least imaginative way, I suppose.
Yeah.
You know? Like, there's vampires existing in a town, there's, like, other evil vampires, there's, you know, I feel like there's so many more interesting things that could have gone with than, like, you know, werewolf love interests.
Yeah.
And, you know, pacts that go back centuries.
Yeah, and I feel like especially as the whole sort of appeal, I think, for the book or the movie is the idea that, you know, if something that's sort of like a mythical creature seems to pick you, you know, seems to be attracted to you and like you for you, then it's this special thing. It's the fantasy of that is very attractive to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I think when you add another character that's also a creature, a fantasy creature, and then them also being in love with the main character, it just feels like it sort of starts to lose that and it becomes too fan-fiction-y.
Yeah. I think that's what it is. Yeah.
So that was our hot take on Twilight.
Yeah. Let us know if you want more hot takes on Twilight.
Thanks for tuning in to Sorry Is This Boring. I'm Natalie.
I'm Marika.
And peace out.